In Memoria Adytum. Of Saarn and Jade tongues. The spray of seawater lashed and whipped at the solitary cowled figure standing atop the cliffs of Naxos, impassively gazing out on the broken vessels that now burned amidst the harbor of the walled city. Their face was hidden, both by a grey cowl of heavy wool and by the tongues of green flame that licked across the armada. Great gouts of jade jumped from ship to ship like a mad beast running its own tongue along its teeth after a grisly meal. Without turning, the figure spoke. How many ships did they lose? Their attendant turned to face the cowled figure, his armor clattering loudly as he did. He was dressed in roughly hewn scales of hammered bronze, decorated in a thin filigree of inlaid copper. Some 30 transports all, my lady. See how they perish from the hubris of their own foul weaponry. Weaponry that we turned against them, thought Klavigar Saarn, her green eyes burning bright as the Mechanite fleet. Some time earlier. The sun was vicious during the daylight, and so Saarn had adopted the customs of the local populace, wearing robes of silk and shifts of linen, depending upon the particular demands of the occasion. She had even adopted their faces and skin tone, twisting her own flesh into that of a Greek. At present, she found herself wearing a rather fetching robe woven from red silk and golden samite. An iron brooch fashioned into the shape of a nesting viper pinned the fabrics together. Beneath all that clothing, a pair of blades were concealed against the shadow of her body. The city of Naxos was impressively foreboding. It had two entrances, the Gate of Naxos and the Sea Gate. The first of these, the Gate, was constructed from colossal portcullises of crossed iron, and was reputedly impenetrable. Though apparently, reputation alone had not been sufficient to ward off attempts to breach it by wayward nations and jealous rivals. All attempts thus far had been repulsed by the infamous legions of Naxos. These legions consisted of free-born men and women taken from their families at birth as tribute to the city itself. They were raised to know no fear, to submit to no tyrant, and held no loyalty other than to the city and her people. It was little wonder then that they were affectionately named the children of Naxos by the citizens. At the southern side of the city, opposite the Gate of Naxos, as one ran through the market stalls that lined the central river of the city, lay the Sea Gate. Unlike its sibling, it was protected by far thinner walls and enshrouded several locks. Laying at the mouth of the Aegean Sea, the Sea Gate protected the harbor, which was currently occupied by a grand Mechanite armada. Naxos had joined the numerous political entities, including the Mechanites, who opposed the Kalmuktama Empire, her Ozyrmak's empire. Like an arrow in darkness, Saarn slipped through the streets of Naxos and beneath an eavesdrop marking the meeting point between herself and the contact within the city. Saarn smiled to herself as she slipped her hands into the deep pockets of her robe, gently patting the bone handles of her knives, one half still wet with warm blood. It appeared that the gates of Naxos had never considered that someone might simply slide through the iron portcullis, twisting their very body into tendrils of rope-like flesh, and reforming theirself on the other side. And neither, it seemed, had the guard watching on with utter horror. "You are late," came a quiet and effeminate voice lurking around the bend of the wall. "Sister, we are like passing ships in the night. And silence is close at hand, sister," Saarn replied in a whisper. "What would you know?" the voice asked. Saarn recognized that voice, hollow and devoid of any emotion, though she could not entirely place the accent. An echoed, dying remnant of one of the myriad cults that had fallen before Adytum, perhaps. "I would know your face before you vanish into the nest of vipers. I could use allies tonight." "Very well," the voice responded as a pale woman rounded the corner. She wore a heavy gray linen dress with a black cape flowing out behind it. The entire ensemble was lined with golden thread, which adorned the hems of the dress. Her face was concealed beneath a black hood, though Saarn could make out a red welt across the left of the woman's jaw. Attiring yourself like a follower of the old Black King would be a fatal mistake if one discovered the truth of your mission, Saarn replied after taking careful notice of the slender blade strapped to the woman's hip. Luckily, none have. She smiled, stepping out from under the eavesdrop and into the light as the golden thread of her dress glistened under the sun. I know their words and symbols well. Saarn followed the cloaked figure out into the streets of Naxos, feeling the worn, sun-baked cobbles through the soles of her sandals. The followers of the old Black King belonged to an ancient cult that had been prolific throughout the frozen wastelands of Siberia, until they were condemned as heretics by the Kalmaktama and the Davites before them. Their followers were executed in droves, summarily, if they confessed their heresies, and flayed alive if they refused to repent. The Armada moves tonight. This is our final chance to remove that dreaded fire from their hands. We'll stop the Mechanites here at Naxos, a wondrous victory for the Holocaust. Nobody has to die tonight. I'm aware of that. Have you located their stockpile of sea fire? Saarn asked as they crossed the street and made for the temple of the old Black King. It was a lonely building of blackened stone sticking out like a sore thumb amongst the sandstone buildings which cramped the streets of Naxos. I have. It is beneath the temple of Mechane. The woman answered, tapping at the etchings of bronze concealed within the cast iron handle of the door. Alchemical etchings, Saarn guessed, from their shape. Those elemental currents hung heavy about the temple of the old Black King, swirling and dancing about the air, and the door swung open. The cloaked lady entered first, gently closing the door behind Saarn. The temple was entirely empty, unsurprisingly, considering that the entirety of the old Black King's surreptitious worshippers were now dead, or worse. Saarn drew up a chair and sat herself down. Despite being windowless, the room remained illuminated by a dull haze of coalescent light. My real name is Yulia. She drew in a breath and let the elements settle once more, bathing the room in bright light. I do not expect you to share your real name, but I'd feel more comfortable addressing you as something other than sister. It becomes awfully tiring. Saarn nodded. You may call me Jalista. Very well. Jalista, the stockade of sea fire is concealed beneath the temple of Mechane, guarded closely by legates faithful and legates primus. No doubt it'll prove difficult to move such dangerous weaponry between just the two of us. Saarn interjected as she gently ran her fingers along the hilt of her knives. Once slick with wet blood, the blade had slaked its thirst, and was now dry as its bone haft. Nonsense. I've already made it much easier for us both. Yulia stood and stamped her foot against the floor of the temple. A loud mechanical clink rang out, and a trapdoor opened behind Yulia. See. Saarn moved from her seat and looked down into the cavernous space beneath the temple. Tunnels? She asked. Dug with the Terranus ethers. They stretch across Naxos, and one of these tunnels so happens to emerge directly beneath a basement concealed within the temple of Mechane. When? Saarn asked, her green eyes piercing into the gloom. As soon as you like, Jalista. Saarn dropped into the pit enclosed within the temple of the old Black King, watching as Yulia closed the trapdoor behind the pair. Saarn had changed to better suit her environment, a pair of moleskin riding boots and a crisp leather hauberk. She shunned gloves at all times, preferring to feel the bone handles pressing against her palms. The leather tinning about the smooth bone provided grip, even when they were coated with warm and wet blood. Her knives lusted for blood, drinking it deep, and channeling her flesh crafting through it. Yulia hadn't changed a thing about her attire. Saarn suspected that the dress might have been treated with alchemical properties, or maybe enhanced with arcane wards. She couldn't be sure as the pair padded silently within the crumbling tunnels. The scent of death was all about her, not fresh death, no metallic sense of blood or the pleasant scent of flesh, only the stench of rot and bone. Are we beneath the graveyard, Yulia? Saarn asked as she shifted her paired knives from her belt, sliding the shorter parrying dagger into the scabbard on her legs. We're inside the graveyard. These are the catacombs of old that the ancestors of Naxos would inter their dead within. That custom has become lost to them, hence their obsession with burning the dead, Jalista. I see. Saarn muttered as she kicked the rotting bones of a rat down the channels that ran along either side of the path. The musty and damp smell of mud choking at her lungs, she hurried her way through the compact tunnels of earth. Their obsession with burning the dead. She grinned at that. She would give them a funeral pyre they wouldn't soon forget, something to remember their treachery by. Here, Jalista. Yulia stopped and gestured towards the ceiling. There above our heads. Nodding, Saarn pulled her long knife free from its scabbard of rough-hewn leather and hammered brass, feeling it tug gently against the inner lining. She raised the knife to her mouth and carefully slid the blade between her teeth, biting down hard to trap it still. Yulia stood to one side with her feet planted slightly apart, grasping the slender blade free of its scabbard. Only now did Saarn come to realize that it was her crosius, the tool of the alchemist. Hers was shaped like a double-edged sword with a slender blade constructed from silvered steel, and finished with a pommel of varnished ebony. She raised it aloft, channeling the filaments of the earth into her left hand, sending them rushing into the ceiling as she mixed streaks of darkness into the stream. The streaks of void tore through the stone floor of the basement, devouring the mortar in a deep black roaring with silent echoes. Saarn tossed the rope up into the hole and slowly ascended into the darkness above. In a single fluid motion, she freed her long knife back into her right hand and carefully navigated the darkness, illuminated by an eerie and sickly green glow. All around her were caches of sea fire, the devastating weapon of the Mechanites. It would stick to clothing, armor, water, even flesh. Clinging desperately, it immolated the victim and burnt them to naught but ashes in minutes, filling the air with the acrid scent of cauterized flesh. A perfect weapon to purge the world of those that worship the flesh. How shall we move these barrels out of this storehouse? Saarn called out to the darkness. Carefully, I suspect, Yulia replied. A faint glow illuminated Saarn's side, revealing Yulia in a mixture of pallid green and bright white light. I can channel the airness ethers to move them into the tunnel, but it will take some time. Saarn nodded. Hoping Yulia had seen her silent reply in the dimly lit room, stealthily padding over to stand by the storeroom door, she reversed the grip on her long knife as she slid the parrying dagger free from her boot. In close quarters, she could open a throat with the dagger quicker than she might stick a pig with the knife. She could hear two voices out on the corridor, both Greek and heavily laden with tongues of wine. I heard the Armada set sail tonight. And I heard that some cunning paid me back for the vases of wine I bought him and his wife out of my own pay. All right, Alexios, what do I owe? 2 whores and a new spearhead would be a St. 2. You don't have 2 cocks, Alexios. But I do have 2 hands and a cock. Beg off, 1 and a new spear. Deal. The voices trailed off as one of the guards stumbled off, his armored scales clanking against one another as he heaved loudly. Jalista! Jalista! Yulia was yelling in a hoarse whisper, a cache of Greek fire dangling precipitously off the cavernous hole in the basement floor. Sprinting at pace, Saarn helped steady the copper drum while Yulia channeled the airness ethers once more and balanced the drum back to center. With a violent clang, the door to the basement was swung open by the helmeted guard who slowly made his way into the room, lowering his spear and waving it about in front of him. His spear tip, bronze armor, and youthful face illuminated in the sickly glow of jade. Yulia and Saarn split to opposite sides of the rooms. Gesturing with her knife, Saarn sidled forwards against the wall as Yulia jumped into the hole, the sound of her fall buffered by a cushion of air. Slipping behind the guard, Saarn attempted to slide the long knife between his neck guard and helmet. It ripped against the chain mail beneath and rings of metal erupted along her blade. Flesh and blood tore free from the gaping wound that she created in his neck. The guard spun, catching Saarn in the thigh and slashing ribbons from her hauberk. The spear point had torn away at the flesh beneath. but she quickly crafted the flesh before her wound began to bleed. She caught the force of his blow with her parrying dagger and turned it down, reversing the spear point into the ground, and driving her knee into his stomach. Winded, the guard clutched at his chest and dropped his spear, making for the sword strapped at his side. The mistake of youth, Saarn thought, as she slashed the long knife into the gap at his neck once more, feeling the chain of glistening rubies slide free from his throat. The young man collapsed to the floor, his free hand clutching at his throat as his dominant hand tightened about the hilt of his sword. Saarn placed both knives into their sheaths at her hip. Stepping carefully over the body, she shut the door to the basement and descended the rope, catching one final glimpse at the young mechanite guard drowning in his own blood. Yulia and Saarn stood alone in the temple of the old Black King. Saarn was idly cleaning her long knife with an oiled cloth as Yulia examined the 15 caches of Greek fire that now stood as menhirs in the Black King's hall. The hall was a simple place, barren and devoid of any connection to emotion. Hanging above the dais was a simple painting, displaying 2 masked women impaling snakes with swords. They were accompanied by a figure shrouded in darkness, with a golden crown perching on his brow. Beneath the 3 large figures were a group of humans, offering cupped hands towards the old Black King and his 2 attendants. The old Black King had been a harsh figure, his reign swiftly ended by the diva. Do we have allies within the city? People we can deliver these weapons to? Yulia asked, etching yet more alchemical symbols into the surface of the caches. Bonding seals to prevent the volatile sea fire from detonating. She thinks we're just neutralizing these weapons, Saarn thought. Outside of the city. I plan to smuggle them out now in a wagon driven by one of our men. Will you come with us? I don't plan to spend another night in this wretched city. Yulia turned in her seat. Saarn noticed that she still concealed her face within the hood of her cloak. What do you plan to do with these? Only Clarali knows. I haven't been informed of his plans, have you? Saarn asked, cautiously probing Yulia's information. No, I hope he won't use them. We'd be no better than. A loud knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Yulia opened the door as a burly, armored man barged into the room, kneeling down before Saarn. My lady, the wagon is ready. With a nod, Saarn rose to her feet and made her way over to the wagon, leaving Yulia and her attendant, Clarali to fill the wagon themselves. Leaving the city had been easy, a simple ride down the central avenue that marked the market street of Naxos, and then presenting their forged documents to the legionnaire that manned the gates. Inspections were completely avoided by Yulia's use of alchemy and Saarn's glamour upon the caches of sea fire, which had disguised them as simple vases of olive oil. Alka had taken the caches of sea fire and given them over to the faithful, those deemed true adherents of Nalka. Even now, she could see the robed servants, disguised as mechanites through use of carnomancy, boarding the myriad vessels of the armada. Drawing her cowl tight about her face, Saarn watched as Alka strode towards her, his decorated armor glinting beneath the pale moonlight. He walked right up to her and kneeled before her, the horsehair of his great helm writhing in the wind. It is done, my lady. Saarn said nothing as she glanced to her left. Yulia had not moved since the faithful had begun to board the mechanite armada. Her fist was clenched tight around the hilt of her crosius, and her hood disguised the emotion twisting across her face. Yulia. There is nothing more to say between us, Jalista, Yulia said softly, her heavy cape flowing behind her in the cool and crisp breeze of night. Saarn's shoulders tightened, her muscles drawing taut as she watched the amassed armada with gritted teeth. The mechanite fleet was impressive, hulking transports, each one crewed by hundreds of legates, war galleys and dramas with battering rams of brass and hammered bronze, and the behemoth gigantes which bore the colossi, the armored war machines of the mechanite civilization. And then, from out of the gloom, came a sailing merchant ship, carrying itself into the harbor of Naxos upon rotted wood. The ship meandered its way along the harbor, and all around it, the mechanite armada began to split away, veering off their courses to avoid the stray ship. In a flash of jade light, that little merchant ship and the entire mechanite fleet disappeared behind the glow. Seconds later, Saarn felt warm air rush over her skin and tasted burning flesh on her tongue. Writhing tongues of emerald flames whipped and wreathed across the harbor. Splintered fragments of burnt wood were cast through the air and rained back down into the sea. The entire mechanite fleet had been consumed in that conflagration. No man could have survived. Saarn grimaced. Yulia's hood had been knocked from her face, and for the first time, Saarn could see her cold, gray eyes burning with fury, reflections of serpentine flames writhing within those eyes. I watched my people be burned alive by the diva. They'd flay them first, peeling the skin away, inch by inch, to expose the naked flesh beneath. Then they'd stake them through the feet, covering the whole body in pitch, and let the flames lick at the exposed flesh. The diva considered that a mercy. They called the victims of their torture the lucky ones. When I was a young girl, a diva matriarch came from my family. We worshipped the old Black King, the very same king they'd flayed and burnt, for the crime of rejecting the diva. I watched my mother and father die in agony. Before they could do the same to me, a robed man saved my life. I never asked his name, he simply told me that we were free. When I returned to the village, they told me that Ion had delivered them from evil. They repeated the robed man's words, "We are free." Yulia's fist was trembling as her fingers tightened around her crocus, the veins in her wrist throbbing. I was there at Adytum. I listened to Ion preach his heart out to the hawkos that crowded and braying herd of sheep. I believed that Ion was better than the diva. He knew what it was like to suffer. His sermons were filled with grief. He was a wretch, just the same as me. That innocent little girl looked upon him with doe eyes and doted upon him. She turned toward Saarn, the burned flesh of her lower jaw twisting her face into a snarl of agony. "You have killed that girl today, Saarn." Saarn felt her heart twist as Yulia walked into the shadow of Naxos, her golden-hemmed cloak casting long shadows amidst tongues of jade.